Welcome back to Outside Views, and bro, we need to talk. And today we're tackling the question that has hung over British politics like a permanent cloud of smog for nearly a decade. Who is to blame for this disaster, this mess we call Brexit? It's a question that requires a ruthless honesty because after years of denial, the truth is finally undeniable. It doesn't matter what corner of the political world you occupy. By 2025, the national consensus is that leaving the European Union, at least in the manner it was executed, was a monumental mistake. The Prime Minister himself has finally broken the great political taboo and admitted it was a national misstep, a disastrous failure of the promised liberation. And this is not an objective assessment. This is my personal, deeply held view on a political debacle, and the blame is not single, but spread across a chain of ambition, cowardice, and outright deceit, what you will hear in this video. And the story of blame must begin with David Cameron. He is the man who lit the fuse, the man who called the referendum not for the sake of the nation, but for the sake of his deeply divided Conservative Party. Facing pressure from Eurosceptic MPs and the insurgent populist threat of Nigel Farage's UKIP, Cameron chose to gamble the entire future of his country on an internal party management problem. He convinced himself he could negotiate a minor deal with the EU, secure an easy Remain victory, and finally sort out his troublesome backbenchers. It was the original sin of the entire Brexit era. A massive national plebiscite called for the pettiest of political self-interests. When he lost, he committed the second act of profound irresponsibility. He resigned the very next morning, leaving absolutely no plan, no roadmap, and no leadership for the path ahead. He got the country into this existential crisis, and then walked away as the flames started to rise. His legacy is political cowardice, disguised as principle. Next, we must hold the Vote Leave campaign and its most prominent figures accountable for their outright lies and cynical opportunism. And this is where Boris Johnson and Michael Gove enter the Hall of Shame. They fronted a campaign that sold a dream that was impossible to deliver. The promise of £350 million a week for the NHS, you know that was a lie. The idea of instantly striking better trade deals across the globe. The entire concept of simply taking back control without cost. It was all deliberate fantasy. They gave the Leave movement its slogans and its swagger, but they gave it absolutely zero substance. Johnson in particular turned a political gamble into a cult-like crusade, given credibility to claims that he himself knew were exaggerated or false. And when he finally secured power with a mandate to get Brexit done, he pursued the hardest possible exit, severing ties with the single market and customs union, replacing economic strategy with a mere three-word slogan. The result was not liberation but economic isolation, customs red tape, and collapsing export volumes. That's a 15% drop in trade with the EU compared to pre-Brexit trends, and an OBR estimate that the economy is now 4% smaller than it would have been. The economic damage they dismissed as Project Fear is now simply Project Reality, and their refusal to admit the cost is a continued failure of leadership. And what about the self-styled champion of the people? Yeah, of course, Nigel Farage. His contribution was to weaponize frustration and amplify a long-running anti-EU sentiment that had been carefully nurtured by decades of press distortion. Farage successfully tapped into genuine grievances about immigration, globalization, and feeling left behind, the real social tensions that had been ignored by the political elite. He made Brexit politically inevitable, a force no one could ignore, but he consistently evaded all responsibility for the ensuing chaos. He claimed victory and immediately walked away from the execution, only to return years later to promise to finish the job with his Reform UK party, now driving political disruption and proving that the far-right populist flame he lit is still very much alive. Farage is the eternal disruptive force, happy to set fire to the building, but unwilling to help rebuild it. A figure whose power lies entirely in anger and disillusionment. However, the blame cannot be contained to the conservative and populist right. The Labour Party's leadership at the time under Jeremy Corbyn is also deeply culpable for its failure to provide an effective unifying opposition. Corbyn's heart was clearly never truly in the Remain campaign. A lifelong Eurosceptic, his participation was half-hearted and entirely ambiguous. His refusal to take a clear, decisive stand on a second referendum allowed the Leave rhetoric to dominate in traditional Labour heartlands, making it easy for Johnson to scoop up the votes of working-class people who felt ignored by their own party. And Labour's ambiguity created a void, leaving voters confused and divided, which led directly to Johnson's 2019 landslide and the mandate for the hardest, most damaging form of Brexit imaginable. Except WTO, I know that one, but that would just have been self-unaliving. The failure of the opposition to oppose effectively gave the hardliners a blank check for national self-harm. And let's not forget the role of the British tabloid press. For decades, the tabloid media machine turned the European Union into a grotesque, convenient cartoon villain, a scapegoat for every domestic problem actually made in Westminster. And this drip of misleading stories and outright falsehoods, like the infamous claims that the Queen backed Brexit, which were later proven false, created a permanent tide of misinformation. And this systemic fueling of myths about Brussels and immigration normalized distortion and made it almost impossible for rational economic arguments to be heard above the noise of invented outrage. And this press, for too long, prioritized sensationalism and political alliance over factual reporting, and their collective action played a huge role in carrying the country out of the EU on a wave of popular myth. And finally, we must address the most difficult element, the electorate itself. Millions of people voted to leave in good faith. They were not voting for economic ruin. They were voting for sovereignty, fairness, and a belief in their country's ability to chart its own course. They were sold a message of hope, promised sovereignty and prosperity, but they got neither, and they never could have gotten that. They were, however, responsible for accepting the claims of politicians over the overwhelming consensus of experts, economists, and international partners. While they were undoubtedly misled, they are the final step in the chain of blame, having voted for a dream that, as promised, could never exist. The truth is, Brexit, or the catastrophic version of it you are still living through in the UK, was an act of national self-harm committed with many hands on the knife. David Cameron lit the fuse out of political desperation. Boris Johnson and his allies fueled the blaze with slogans and deceit, delivering a hard border and trade friction. Nigel Farage whipped up the wind of populism, setting the stage, but offering no solution. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour stood by, paralysed by indecision, allowing the most damaging course to become reality. And the tabloid press ensured the atmosphere was thick with distortion, blinding the electorate to the facts. And 9 years later, the social, political and economic damage is profound. Diplomatically, Britain has been reduced from a bridge between the US and Europe to an isolated spectator. Socially, the divides between regions and generations have deepened, fueling independence movements in Scotland and border tensions in Northern Ireland. And culturally, opportunities have been deliberately shrunk for young people and businesses. The surrender of influence is the cost of the restored sovereignty. And the final act in this drama is the emerging reckoning signaled by the Prime Minister's recent admission. The great national silence is finally cracking, with polls showing around 60% of Britons now believing leaving was a mistake. But the debate is far from over. Nigel Farage is back from the political wilderness, capitalizing on the continuing anger, promising to finish Brexit with Reform UK, forcing the government onto the defensive. And for all their differences, the former Remainer Starmer and the lifelong Brexiteer Farage now agree on one point. Britain got Brexit wrong. The only argument left is who the country will trust to fix it. The man who says he can make the current relationship work, or the man who still vows to drive it further into isolation. And for me, the answer is clear. The people responsible for the biggest peacetime mistake in modern British history were the political class who, for their own gain, convinced millions to vote against their own interests, and then proved themselves utterly incapable of managing the fallout. They have permanently damaged their country for a momentary hold on power. And that, in my view, is an unforgivable legacy. So thank you for watching this outside view, and I'm really looking forward to your opinion on this one, who you think is to blame for Brexit. And if you want to see another video right now, the next one is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.